The screaming began by the third hour of darkness. Not the screaming of men dying under enemy fire, but the wet, gargling screams of Private Hendricks as Commissar Volk tore his tongue out with rusted pliers. The crime was whispering during evening roll call. The punishment was administered in the center of our holding pen while we stood at attention, forbidden to look away, forbidden to close our eyes. Volk held the bloody mass of muscle high above his head, letting crimson droplets spatter across the rockcrete floor, and told us that this was mercy. This was the Emperor's grace made manifest. We believed him because we had no choice. Because the explosive collar locked around each of our throats would detonate if our heartbeats suggested rebellion. Because in the Penal Legions of the Imperium, even your body betrays you. My name was Matthias Cade, and I had been a forge worker on Helicon Prime before the Arbites came. They arrived during the night shift. Their carapace armor black as the void between stars, their shock mauls crackling with suppression fields that made your teeth ache just standing near them. I never learned what my crime was. The trial lasted 4 minutes. The judge was a servitor with a cracked vox grill that repeated the word guilty in a flat, mechanical drone while dried blood crusted around its augmetic jaw. They shaved my head in the transport. They branded my left cheek with the mark of the condemned. They stripped away my name and gave me a number instead, Penal Legionnaire 447783 Cade. By the time we reached the regimental staging area on Vortigern's world, I understood that I was no longer human. I was ammunition. I was a resource to be expended. The first thing you notice about a Penal Legion is the smell. It hangs in the air like a physical presence, a mixture of human waste and chemical accelerants and the sweet, sick stench of untreated wounds going septic. The second thing you notice is the silence, not true silence, but the absence of normal human noise. No laughter, no casual conversation, just the shuffle of boots on metal floors, and the occasional sob quickly stifled before a commissar could hear it. The third thing you notice is the collars. Every legionnaire wears one, a band of pitted steel locked around the throat with a red light that pulses in time with your heartbeat. Inside that collar is a shaped explosive charge powerful enough to separate your head from your shoulders. The commissars carry detonators on their belts. They activate them remotely. They activate them often. The holding pens were converted cargo containers stacked 5 high, each one designed to house 40 men, but crammed with twice that number. We slept standing up, pressed so tightly together that when one man collapsed from exhaustion, he remained upright, held in place by the bodies around him. The air was thick and hot and difficult to breathe. The waste buckets overflowed within hours. Disease spread through us like wildfire through dry timber. Twice a day they opened the doors and threw in ration packs. Not enough for everyone, never enough. Men fought over them with the desperation of drowning souls clawing for the surface. I saw a man kill his friend over half a protein bar, strangling him with his bare hands while tears streamed down both their faces. Training began the day after we arrived. They marched us out into the killing fields at dawn, a vast expanse of cratered earth dotted with rusted razor wire and the skeletal remains of previous training exercises. Commissar Volk stood on a platform constructed from ammunition crates, his long coat snapping in the wind, his augmetic eye glowing red in the half-light. He told us that we were filth. He told us that we were less than nothing. He told us that the only way to redeem our worthless souls was to die well, to die screaming the Emperor's name, to die knowing that our blood would water the soil of some distant world and fertilize the Imperium's eternal expansion. Then he ordered us to run. The course was 3 kilometers long and studded with live fire hazards. Automated turrets tracked our movement, their targeting algorithms set to wound rather than kill. Landmines buried at random intervals, razor wire stretched at neck height, pits filled with rusted metal spikes. We ran because stopping meant the collar would detonate. We ran because the commissars followed behind us with bolt pistols, executing anyone who fell. I saw men torn apart by sustained autocannon fire. I saw men step on mines and simply vanish in a spray of red mist. I saw a man stumble into razor wire and hang there screaming while the barbs cut deeper with every breath. The commissars did not help him. They used him as a lesson, pointing to his writhing form and explaining that this was what happened to the weak, the unworthy, the damned. We completed the course with 60% casualties. Volk congratulated us. He said we had performed adequately for scum. He said that tomorrow would be harder. He was not lying. The next day, they activated the turrets at full power. The day after that, they introduced flamers. By the end of the first week, our numbers had been reduced by half. The survivors were lean and hollow-eyed and moved with the jerky, panicked efficiency of prey animals. We learned to run without thinking, to dodge without conscious thought, to accept that the man beside you would be dead within moments, and that mourning him was a luxury you could not afford. The equipment we received was worse than nothing. It was actively hostile to survival. Lasguns so old and poorly maintained that they exploded if fired more than a dozen times in succession. Flak armor riddled with holes and missing plates. Helmets with cracked visors. Boots that fell apart after a week of marching. There was a reason for this, of course. Everything in the Imperium has a reason. The Munitorum could not waste functional equipment on men expected to die within hours of deployment. Better to give us the broken scraps, the refused, the gear that regular guard regiments had condemned as unusable. Better to spend nothing on our survival and everything on our exploitation. The collars were the only equipment maintained with obsessive care. Every morning, tech priests in grease, stained robes moved through the pens, checking each device with handheld Auspex scanners. They adjusted the detonation thresholds. They calibrated the biometric sensors. They ensured that any attempt to remove the collar would trigger immediate execution. Some men tried anyway. Legionnaire 334119 Varus spent 6 hours with a stolen file, working with infinite patience, convinced he had found a way to defeat the locking mechanism. He was 3/4 through the outer casing when the tamper alarm activated. The explosion was small and precise. It removed everything above his shoulders. His body remained standing for nearly 5 seconds before it toppled forward. Our first deployment came without warning. One moment we were enduring another training exercise. The next we were being herded into bulk landers while commissars screamed orders and beat anyone too slow to comply. The interior of the lander was pitch black and unbearably hot. We were packed in so tightly that breathing required effort. The flight lasted 4 hours. Men vomited. Men soiled themselves. Men died, crushed by the press of bodies or suffocated by the lack of air. When the ramp finally dropped and we stumbled out into the light, I saw that we had landed in the middle of a war zone. The planet was called Hadria Secundus, though we only learned that much later. All we knew was fire and noise and the stench of burning promethium. The sky was the color of old bruises, stained with smoke from 1,000 fires. The ground was a churned morass of mud and blood and shell fragments. Ahead of us, barely visible through the haze, stood the enemy fortifications. Trenches and bunkers and gun emplacements that stretched from horizon to horizon. Behind us stood the commissars with their bolt pistols and their detonators. The choice was simple. Advance into certain death or die. Where we stood, we advanced. We advanced because human beings will choose even a slim chance of survival over immediate execution. We advanced because the collars registered forward momentum and would detonate if we stopped. We advanced because somewhere in the broken architecture of our minds, we still hoped, still believed that perhaps if we fought hard enough, if we killed enough enemies, we might earn redemption, might earn the right to die with honor instead of as condemned criminals. The belief was a lie, but it was the only lie we had left. The no man's land between our landing zone and the enemy trenches was 2 kilometers of absolute hell. Heavy bolter fire cut through us like a scythe through wheat. Artillery shells burst overhead, raining shrapnel that punched through our inadequate armor and tore men into bloody fragments. Last fire turned the air into a lattice of crimson death. I ran through it all, my mind blank with terror, my legs pumping mechanically, my fingers locked around a lasgun I barely remembered how to fire. Men fell around me in waves. Men I had never known. Men whose names I would never learn. They fell and were trampled and forgotten in the same instant. I do not remember reaching the enemy trench. One moment I was running, the next I was falling, tumbling down a slope of sandbags and into a narrow channel filled with soldiers who wore armor I did not recognize and shouted in a language I did not understand. They shot at me. I shot back. My lasgun overheated and burned my hands, and I kept firing anyway because stopping meant death. A soldier lunged at me with a bayonet, and I beat him down with my rifle stock, slamming it into his face until the weapon broke and his skull caved in. Another soldier grabbed me from behind, and I drove my thumbs into his eyes until he released me. I killed 4 men in that trench, maybe 5. I lost count. I lost everything except the animal need to survive. By the time reinforcements arrived, the trench was ours. Of the 300 legionnaires who had made the charge, 17 remained alive. Commissar Voke stood among the corpses, his bolt pistol still smoking, and told us we had performed adequately. He said nothing about the men we had lost. He said nothing about the bodies stacked like cordwood behind us. He simply ordered us to hold the position while regular guard units moved up to consolidate our gains. Then he walked away, already planning the next expenditure. The days that followed blurred together into a nightmare without beginning or end. We fought because we had no choice. We died because we were expected to. Each morning brought a new objective, a new impossibility, a new sacrifice demanded in the Emperor's name. We assaulted fortified bunkers with nothing but lasguns and bayonets. We cleared minefields by walking through them, our bodies triggering the explosives so that more valuable troops could advance safely. We held positions against counterattacks that outnumbered us 10 to 1, ordered to die where we stood rather than retreat. And we obeyed, we always obeyed. The collars ensured obedience. Hunger became our constant companion. The rations we received were insufficient to sustain life, let alone combat operations. We lost weight with terrifying speed, our bodies consuming themselves, muscle and fat melting away until we resembled the walking corpses we would soon become. We scavenged everything. We ate roots and insects and things we could not identify. We stole from the dead, both enemy and friendly, going through their pockets and packs with the efficiency of carrion birds. I once found a half-eaten ration bar in the hand of a dead guard officer. I pried it from his stiffening fingers and devoured it without thought, without shame, without anything except the hollow relief of momentary satiation. Water was worse. The planet's water supply was contaminated with industrial runoff and worse things that had no name in any language I knew. We drank it anyway because the alternative was death by dehydration. Within days, disease tore through our ranks. Dysentery, cholera, infections that turned men's insides to liquid and left them screaming in agony as their bodies devoured themselves. The Medica did nothing for us. Their supplies were reserved for proper soldiers, not expendable criminals. We tended our own wounds with strips torn from the dead and prayer and nothing else. Most wounds went septic. Most men died. Sleep was impossible. When we were not fighting, we were digging trenches, fortifications, mass graves. The commissars drove us with whips and clubs and the constant threat of detonation. We worked until we collapsed. Then we were beaten until we stood and worked again. I learned to sleep standing up, my body propped against a trench wall, my mind shutting down for precious seconds before a shout or a blow snapped me back to consciousness. I learned to dream of nothing. Dreams were dangerous. Dreams reminded you that there had once been another life, another world, another possibility. Dreams killed you more surely than any enemy weapon. Yet even in hell, humans find ways to connect. We formed bonds despite the futility, despite knowing that everyone around us would be dead within days. Shared suffering created a strange intimacy, a brotherhood forged in blood and desperation. I learned the stories of the men who fought beside me, not their names but their crimes. Legionnaire 5523 had struck an overseer who was beating his daughter. Legionnaire 68091 had stolen food to feed his starving family. Legionnaire 7104 had spoken against a corrupt administratum official. Most of us were guilty of nothing except being inconvenient, being poor, being in the wrong place when quotas needed filling. We developed systems of survival that existed in the spaces between official notice. We pooled our rations, ensuring that no one starved completely. We created a rotation for sentry duty that allowed everyone a few hours of real rest. We shared information about commissar patrols and safe routes through the trenches, and which areas were most likely to draw artillery fire. We stole medical supplies from dead Medica and tended each other's wounds in the darkness. We became a unit not through training or indoctrination, but through the simple recognition that we were all we had. That in a galaxy that viewed us as refuse, we were the only ones who saw each other as human. The mental toll was worse than any physical suffering. You could endure hunger. You could endure pain. You could endure exhaustion so profound that your body moved without conscious direction. But you could not endure the knowledge that you did not matter, that your death would be unrecorded and unmourned, that the Imperium you served viewed your entire existence as a rounding error in a logistics report. Some men broke under that weight. They stopped eating, stopped moving, stopped caring. They sat in the trenches with empty eyes and waited for death to claim them. The commissars shot them and moved on. Others broke differently. They became zealots, true believers who convinced themselves that their suffering had meaning, that the emperor watched them personally and weighed their agonies against their sins. They charged into battle screaming prayers, convinced that martyrdom would wash away their crimes and guarantee them a place at the emperor's side. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps faith could survive even this. But I watched those zealots die the same way everyone else died, torn apart by bolt of fire or consumed by flames or buried under collapsing trenches. Their faith changed nothing. The galaxy did not care. I survived by becoming something less than human. I stopped thinking about the future because there was no future. I stopped thinking about the past because the past was gone. I existed only in the eternal present, each moment a separate universe containing nothing except immediate survival. When they told me to advance, I advanced. When they told me to dig, I dug. When they told me to kill, I killed. I became a machine made of meat, operating on autopilot, my humanity buried so deep that nothing could touch it. It was the only way to survive, to become the thing they believed we already were. The executions were constant. Men died not just from combat but from the casual brutality of those who commanded us. A commissar executed Legionnaire 408112 for looking at him wrong. Another executed Legionnaire 5331 for asking about water rations. A third executed an entire squad because one man had fallen asleep on watch. The executions were never quick. The commissars used their bolt pistols, aiming for the torso rather than the head, ensuring that death took minutes rather than seconds. They wanted us to hear the screaming, wanted us to understand that mercy was not merely absent but actively forbidden, that the Imperium's justice was eternal and absolute and completely indifferent to suffering. The collars detonated randomly too. Sometimes they malfunctioned. Sometimes the biometric sensors registered false positives. Sometimes they simply exploded without warning or reason. I saw Legionnaire 6234 helping another man bandage a wound when his collar detonated, taking both their heads. I saw Legionnaire 7891 laughing at a bitter joke when his collar exploded, ending the first moment of joy I had witnessed in weeks. The tech priests blamed maintenance issues, blamed poor quality components, blamed the will of the machine god. They did nothing to fix the problems. The collars were meant to inspire terror, and malfunctions served that purpose as well as intentional detonations. We learned to stop thinking of tomorrow. Tomorrow was a lie. Tomorrow was a luxury afforded to people with futures. We had only now, this moment, this breath. When I woke each morning, I did not think about surviving the day. I thought about surviving the next hour, the next minute, the next second. Time became fractured, broken into such small pieces that it ceased to have meaning. I forgot what it felt like to plan, to hope, to imagine that something better might exist beyond the next artillery barrage. Food became everything. Not just sustenance but obsession, the single bright point in an existence defined by deprivation. We fantasized about meals we had eaten in our previous lives, describing them in elaborate detail, savoring the memory of flavor and texture. Legionnaire 5523 could spend an hour describing a meal his mother had prepared, recounting every ingredient, every step of preparation, the exact temperature of the food, the way it had tasted on his tongue. We listened with desperate attention, our minds transforming his words into a shared hallucination, a collective escape from the reality of our empty stomachs. Those conversations were precious. They reminded us that we had once been something other than this. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. We fought traitor guard. We fought cultists. We fought things that had once been human, but had traded their humanity for promises whispered by powers better left unnamed. They all wanted to kill us, and we killed them in return, not from hatred or ideology but from the simple arithmetic of survival. Kill or be killed. Advance or die. Fight or face execution. The reasons behind the war meant nothing to us. High Command issued objectives and we obeyed them without understanding their strategic importance, because understanding required a perspective we did not possess. We were tools. Tools do not need to understand their purpose. I killed my 100th enemy on the 43rd day of the campaign. I know this because I had started keeping count, scratching marks on the inside of my helmet, one line for each confirmed kill. It was meaningless, but humans need meaning even when there is none to be found. The 100th was a cultist armed with an autogun and wearing robes decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly. I shot him from 20 meters, my lasgun finally functioning properly for once, the beam punching through his chest and dropping him instantly. He fell and I moved on, already searching for the next target, already dismissing him from memory. By that point, killing was as natural as breathing. The nights were worse than the days. During the day, there was action, movement, the adrenaline clarity of combat. At night, there was only darkness and memory, and the screams of the wounded dying slowly in no man's land. We could not retrieve them. Orders forbade it. Their suffering served a purpose, the commissars explained. It demoralized the enemy. It reminded us of the cost of failure. So we listened to men we knew, men we had fought beside, calling for help that would never come, calling for their mothers, calling for the emperor, calling for death. Eventually, they stopped calling. Eventually, silence returned. But the silence was worse because you knew what it meant. Legionnaire 523 died on the 51st day. A sniper round caught him in the throat as we advanced across open ground. I was beside him when it happened. I saw the small red hole appear, saw his expression of surprise, saw him raise one hand to his neck as if he could hold the blood inside. He looked at me with questions in his eyes, questions I could not answer. And then he fell. I kept running. I had to. Stopping meant death. His body lay there in the mud and I ran past it and never looked back. That night I tried to remember his real name and could not. He had told me once, but I had forgotten. I had forgotten because remembering was too painful, because every name was another weight added to a burden already too heavy to bear. The rare moments of peace were almost worse than combat. During fighting, you could retreat into instinct, become an animal operating on pure survival reflex. But during the quiet moments, your mind returned. You remembered what you had lost. You saw yourself clearly, saw what you had become, and the recognition was agony. I spent hours staring at my hands, these instruments that had killed so many, and tried to remember when they had last created something instead of destroying. Tried to remember the feeling of doing something other than surviving. The memories were there but felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. Perhaps they did. Perhaps the man I had been was dead, and I was simply a ghost wearing his skin. We discovered that some crimes were not merely punished with service in the Penal Legions, but with service in specific roles within those legions. The mine clearers went first in every advance, walking slowly across contested ground, prodding the earth with bayonets, searching for buried explosives. They rarely survived more than one mission. The human wave assaults went to those deemed particularly unworthy, ordered to charge fortified positions without support or covering fire, their only purpose to exhaust enemy ammunition. The rearguard assignments, the holding actions, the last stands. These were distributed not randomly but with deliberate cruelty, the commissars matching crime to punishment with theological precision. I never learned what determined these assignments. I was spared the worst duties through luck or oversight, or perhaps because my crime had not been severe enough to warrant immediate death. Others were not so fortunate. Legionnaire 68091, who had stolen food for his family, was assigned to a suicide charge on the 73rd day. He was ordered to carry a demolition charge across 300 meters of open ground and destroy an enemy pillbox. He succeeded. The pillbox exploded in a ball of fire that lit the entire battlefield. Legionnaire 6891 did not survive to see it. His redemption, if you could call it that, was purchased at the cost of everything he had been and everything he might have become. The war ground on. We took ground and lost it, and took it again. We fought for objectives whose names we never learned on a planet whose strategic importance was never explained. The casualty reports were staggering, though we only heard fragments through overheard Vox transmissions and scavenged data slates. Entire regiments consumed in days, whole armies vanishing into the meat grinder of attrition warfare, and still reinforcements kept arriving. More Penal Legions, more condemned souls, more ammunition for the Imperium's eternal war machine. Occasionally we encountered regular guard regiments. They treated us with a mixture of contempt and pity. They gave us wide berth in the trenches, as if criminality were contagious. They did not share their food or supplies or even their spaces. We were pariahs among pariahs, the lowest tier of a hierarchy that stretched from the Emperor himself down to us, gutter filth conscripted to die in darkness. Some guard soldiers taunted us. Others simply ignored us. A few showed something that might have been sympathy, though they never acted on it. Fraternization with Penal Legionnaires was forbidden. Compassion was a luxury reserved for those who deserved it. Disease killed more of us than enemy action. The planet's environment was actively hostile to human life, saturated with toxins and pathogens that our bodies had no defense against. Respiratory infections, skin conditions that turned flesh to suppurating sores, fevers that cooked men's brains in their skulls. We died and were replaced with fresh arrivals, a constant circulation of bodies, the Imperium's solution to logistical challenges. Why maintain troops when you could simply import new ones? Why invest in survival when death was cheaper? On the 98th day, something changed. The enemy launched a counteroffensive of such overwhelming force that our lines shattered like glass under a hammer. They came with armor, with aircraft, with weapons that turned entire squads into vapor. We were ordered to hold our positions regardless of cost, to die where we stood, to trade our worthless lives for precious time. The commissars moved among us, their bolt pistols drawn, executing anyone who showed signs of retreat. The collars pulsed red, armed and ready, awaiting the first hint of cowardice. We held for 6 hours. 6 hours of continuous combat against an enemy that vastly outnumbered and outgunned us. We held because retreating meant immediate execution. We held because the human capacity for endurance is effectively limitless when survival is the only alternative. We held because some part of us, buried deep beneath the trauma and brutality, still believed that our suffering had meaning, that we were redeeming something, that the Emperor watched and judged and found our sacrifice acceptable. When the line finally broke, it happened all at once. A concentrated artillery barrage struck our position, collapsing trenches and burying men alive. In the chaos that followed, discipline evaporated. Men ran, men screamed. Men clawed at their collars, trying desperately to remove them before the detonation that was surely coming. The commissars began executing randomly, their bolt pistols barking continuously, but there were too many of us and too few of them. For the first time since conscription, we outnumbered our jailers. Commissar Volk died with his bolt pistol raised, still shouting orders, still threatening, still believing that terror could maintain control. A stray artillery shell caught him directly, ending his life in an instant of white fire. His detonator melted in the blast. Without him, the collars became inert, their threat neutralized by the simple expedient of the person controlling them being atomized. We ran, not in any organized fashion, but as individuals, as scattered survivors, as men who suddenly remembered that they were human, and that humans have an instinct for self-preservation that transcends even the most brutal conditioning. I ran through fire and death and the corpses of everyone I had known. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, and I collapsed in a shell crater 3 kilometers behind what had once been our lines. I lay there, gasping, waiting for the collar to detonate, waiting for a commissar to find me, waiting for death in any form. It did not come. Slowly I reached up and touched the collar. The light was dark. The device was dead. I was free. The realization took time to process. Freedom was not a concept I had allowed myself to consider. The possibility had been so remote, so impossible, that my mind struggled to accept it even as evidence. I spent an hour in that crater, touching the collar repeatedly, convinced that any moment it would activate and remove my head. It did not. Eventually, I gathered the courage to try removing it. The locking mechanism was broken, damaged by the same blast that had killed Volk. It opened with a simple twist, falling away from my throat like shed skin. I wandered the battlefield for days, avoiding patrols, scavenging supplies, trying to formulate some kind of plan. The war continued around me, vast and impersonal. a machine that operated without regard for individual survival. I considered surrendering to another unit, but knew that would mean immediate execution or reconscription. I considered trying to steal transport off-world, but lacked the expertise or resources. I considered simply waiting to die, but the habit of survival was too deeply ingrained. I kept moving because movement was what I knew. Eventually, I found others. Survivors from other penal legions, men and women whose collars had been destroyed or deactivated, who had slipped through the cracks of the Imperium's vast bureaucracy. We formed a group of sorts, not really a unit but a loose collection of individuals bound by shared trauma and mutual need. We survived in the ruins of abandoned settlements, eating whatever we could scavenge, avoiding both sides of the conflict. We became ghosts haunting the edges of the war, neither fully alive nor properly dead. I do not know how long we lasted. Time lost meaning after the collar came off. Weeks, perhaps months. Long enough for the war to move on, for the front lines to shift elsewhere, for our little pocket of no man's land to become forgotten backwater. We built shelters from debris. We planted crops in soil saturated with chemicals and blood. We created something that might charitably be called a life, though it bore little resemblance to anything we had known before. Some of us died anyway. Infections, accidents, suicide. The conditioning ran deep, deeper than any of us realized. Men who had survived months of penal legion service could not survive freedom. They woke screaming. They saw commissars in shadows. They heard the phantom pulse of detonators in their sleep. They put lasguns to their heads and ended themselves, because death was familiar and freedom was not. I understood. There were nights when I considered joining them, when the weight of survival felt heavier than the weight of death had ever been. But I did not die. Perhaps I was too stubborn. Perhaps I was too broken to even properly end myself. Perhaps some part of me still believed that my suffering had purchased something, some meaning or purpose or redemption that I had not yet discovered. I survived because survival was the only skill I possessed, and skills are hard to unlearn even when they cease to serve any purpose. The penal legions of the Imperium continue their operations across 1,000 worlds. Fresh conscripts arrive daily, their heads shaved, their cheeks branded, their humanity stripped away with industrial efficiency. They are told they are redeeming themselves through service. They are told their sacrifice has meaning. They are told the Emperor watches and weighs their suffering against their sins. Perhaps it is true. Perhaps the Emperor does watch, his vast and terrible consciousness cataloging every death, every moment of agony, every life spent in his name. Perhaps our suffering feeds something vast and necessary, a cosmic machinery that requires blood and tears to function. Or perhaps the truth is simpler and more terrible. Perhaps we suffer because suffering is efficient, because condemning criminals to death is more expensive than condemning them to service. Because the Imperium's endless wars require endless bodies, and the Penal Legions provide those bodies at minimal cost. Because in a galaxy of war and nightmare, where every world is threatened and every soul is expendable, the condemned make excellent ammunition. We die in place of others. We die so that more valuable troops might live. We die because someone must, and better us than anyone who matters. I think about the men I knew. Legionnaire 5523 with his stories of his mother's cooking. Legionnaire 6891 who died destroying a pillbox. Legionnaire 7104 who never told me his crime but who shared his rations when I was too weak to stand. They are gone now. Their bodies rotting in mass graves or burned in promethium fires or simply left where they fell. No one mourns them. No one remembers them except me, and my memory is flawed and incomplete, corrupted by trauma and time. They deserved better. We all deserved better, but the galaxy does not distribute justice based on desert. It distributes suffering based on necessity, and we were necessary. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I dream of Commissar Volk. He stands before me with his bolt pistol raised, his augmetic eye glowing red, his voice like grinding metal. He tells me that I am still condemned, that freedom is an illusion, that the collar remains even though I cannot see it, locked around my soul instead of my throat. He tells me that I will never escape what I have become, that the Penal Legion has marked me permanently, transformed me into something that can never return to human society. He tells me that redemption is impossible, that my sins are eternal, That I am damned not by any crime I committed, but simply by virtue of having survived when so many others died. I wake from these dreams with my hand at my throat, feeling for the collar that is no longer there. The phantom sensation persists for hours, a pressure that exists only in memory, but feels as real as anything physical. I wonder if this is my punishment. Not death but life. Not execution but survival. To carry the weight of what I have seen and done. To remember men whose names I have forgotten. To exist as a testament to the Imperium's capacity for cruelty disguised as justice. The Penal Legions are called many things. Redemption squads, expendable assets, bullet catchers, last chances. But the truth is simpler. They are human beings reduced to their most basic utility, stripped of identity and dignity and hope, transformed into tools that exist only to break against the enemy and, in breaking, to achieve something. What that something is varies. Sometimes it is time purchased with blood. Sometimes it is ground taken at unconscionable cost. Sometimes it is simply proof that the Imperium's justice is eternal and absolute, that no crime goes unpunished, that every soul owes a debt that must be repaid regardless of fairness or proportionality. I survived the Penal Legions, but survival is not the same as freedom. I carry my service with me like a physical weight, a burden that colors every thought and poisons every moment of peace. I see the faces of the dead in crowds. I hear explosions in distant thunder. I taste rations in every meal and find them inadequate. I have been shaped by my time in hell, molded into something that cannot exist comfortably in normal society, cannot relate to people who have not known that specific flavor of suffering. And yet I endure. Not because I want to, but because endurance is what I learned. Because giving up would dishonor the memory of those who died. Because somewhere in the broken wreckage of my soul, I still believe that bearing witness matters, that remembering matters, that the condemned deserve to be more than forgotten ammunition, more than statistics in reports that no one reads, more than fuel for a war machine that never stops consuming. This is the truth of the Penal Legions. This is the daily horror of their existence. This is what it means to be judged not worthy of death, but worthy only of dying slowly, publicly, in service to an empire that views your entire life as a rounding error. We were men and women once. We had names and dreams and people who loved us. We committed crimes or were accused of crimes or simply stood in the wrong place when the Arbites came looking for bodies to fill quotas. We were stripped of everything that made us human and sent to die on worlds whose names we never learned, fighting for objectives we did not understand, purchasing victory with currency we did not possess. Some of us survived, most did not, all of us were changed, transformed into creatures that barely resemble what we once were. We are the Imperium's dirty secret, the hidden cost of eternal war, the proof that even in a galaxy of horror, new depths of cruelty can always be found. We are the condemned, the expendable, the damned. We are the Penal Legions, and our suffering is the foundation upon which the Imperium's justice system rests. The collar around my throat is gone, but I still feel its weight. Every morning when I wake, my hand moves automatically to touch bare skin, and for a moment I forget. I forget that I survived. I forget that the war moved on without me. I forget that I am no longer Penal Legionnaire 447783 Cade, but simply Matthias, a name that sounds foreign even in my own thoughts. The forgetting lasts only seconds. Then memory returns, and with it the full weight of everything I have witnessed, everything I have done, everything I have become. The others who survived with me rarely speak of our service. We exist in a pocket of collective silence, each of us nursing wounds that cannot be seen or treated. Sometimes, late at night when the nightmares drive us from sleep, we sit together and say nothing. The silence is communion. The silence is understanding. We do not need to explain because we were there together, because our bodies carry the same scars, because our minds have been shaped by the same horrors. Words would only diminish what we endured, would try to impose meaning on suffering that was fundamentally meaningless. There was a woman among us, a former legionnaire who never told us her crime. She was called 883422 Vess, though after the collars came off she asked us to call her Lena. She survived 3 full campaigns, an unthinkable span for a Penal Legionnaire. Her body was a map of her service, scars layered upon scars, burns and lacerations and the puckered marks of poorly healed gunshot wounds. She rarely slept. When she did, she woke screaming, her hands clawing at her throat, convinced the collar was detonating. We learned to wake her gently, to speak her name quietly until she remembered where she was. Lena died 6 months after we escaped, not from violence or injury but from something internal, some essential part of her that had been destroyed by her service. She simply stopped eating, stopped drinking, stopped caring whether she lived or died. We tried to help her, but help was something we had forgotten how to provide. We had learned survival but not living, had learned endurance but not healing. She wasted away over the course of weeks, her body consuming itself, and near the end she looked at me with eyes that held no accusation, no regret, only a kind of tired relief. She died holding my hand, and her last words were "thank you." I do not know what she was thanking me for. Perhaps for bearing witness, perhaps for simply being there, perhaps for nothing at all. We buried her in soil that still bore the scars of the war. We had no prayers because most of us had lost our faith somewhere between conscription and survival. The Emperor had not saved us. The Emperor had not even acknowledged us. We had been beneath his notice, too insignificant to warrant divine attention, too worthless to merit redemption. If there was a paradise waiting for the faithful, Lena would find it, but I doubted such a place existed. The galaxy was too large and too cruel for the comfort of easy answers. More died over the following months. Suicides mostly, though we never called them that. We said they had left, that they had moved on, that they had found peace. The euphemisms were thin comfort, but comfort was scarce and we took what we could find. Each death diminished us. Each loss was another name forgotten, another story untold, another witness silenced. I began to fear that I would be the last, that I would survive simply because I lacked the courage to end myself, and the responsibility of being sole witness would crush me under its weight. But others remained. A man called Hendrik, who had been a hive ganger before conscription, whose crime had been existing in the wrong territory when the Arbites conducted a sweep. A woman named Olaine, who had been a medica, condemned for treating injured rebels without reporting them to the authorities. A boy, barely 16, called Fen, who had stolen food from a munitorum depot and been sentenced to death by service. We were not a family. Families implied warmth and love and mutual support. We were survivors bound by trauma, existing in proximity because solitude was worse than company, even company as damaged as ourselves. We built something resembling a settlement in the ruins. Nothing permanent. Nothing that would draw official attention. Just shelters constructed from debris and scavenged materials, a small garden where we grew protein, moss and nutrient fungus, a cistern that collected rainwater we boiled before drinking. It was barely enough to sustain life, but barely enough had always been sufficient for us. We had learned to exist on nothing. Actual resources, however meager, felt like luxury. The war had moved on, but its remnants remained. Unexploded ordnance buried in the soil, contaminated zones where chemical weapons had been deployed, mass graves that we avoided out of respect and revulsion. The planet would bear the scars of conflict for centuries, perhaps millennia. Worlds never truly recovered from the Imperium's wars. They simply waited until the next conflict arrived to add fresh wounds to old. Occasionally we saw patrols, guard units conducting sweeps, searching for enemy holdouts or salvaging equipment from abandoned positions. We hid from them, concealing ourselves in ruins or underground, waiting until they passed. We could not risk contact. Our brands marked us as condemned. Our lack of collars marked us as escapees. Discovery meant execution, no trial, no questions, just bolt rounds to the skull and bodies left for scavengers. The Imperium did not forgive desertion, did not acknowledge that circumstances might complicate simple categories of guilt and innocence. We had been judged once and the judgment was eternal. Hendrik once suggested we try to leave the planet, stow away on a transport or bribe our way onto a merchant vessel. The suggestion sparked hours of debate, our voices rising with desperate hope before reality reasserted itself. We had no currency, no identification, no way to move through Imperial space without triggering immediate arrest. Our faces were in databases, our biometric signatures recorded and catalogued. The Imperium's bureaucracy was vast and incompetent in many ways, but it excelled at tracking the condemned. We were trapped not by physical barriers, but by the sheer administrative weight of our own documented existence. So we remained, Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Time passed with the quality of a fever dream, simultaneously too fast and too slow, marked only by the changing seasons and the gradual deterioration of our makeshift settlement. We grew thinner despite our efforts, grew quieter despite our attempts at conversation, grew more distant from the people we had been until those former selves felt like myths, stories we had heard about strangers who shared our names. I found myself thinking often about the men who had died, not the circumstances of their deaths, which were uniformly horrible, but the details of their lives before conscription. Legionnaire 5523 had been a factory worker with a wife and 2 daughters. Legionnaire 6891 had been a farmer whose crop had failed, forcing him to steal to feed his family. Legionnaire 7104 had been a scribe who had made the mistake of recording accurate information in a report when lies would have been more convenient. They had been ordinary people caught in the machinery of imperial justice, ground to pulp not because they were evil, but because they were convenient. The guilt of survival grew heavier with time. Why had I lived when so many others died? There was no good answer, no virtue I possessed that they lacked, no special quality that had preserved me through circumstances that killed them. I survived through luck and chance and the random distribution of death. Survived because I had been standing 5 meters to the left when the artillery struck, because I had chosen that path instead of that one, because a sniper had aimed at someone else. The arbitrariness was maddening. It suggested that life and death were not matters of skill or faith or worthiness, but simply chaos wearing the mask of order. Olaine tried to maintain her medical knowledge, practicing on those of us who still lived, treating minor injuries with scavenged supplies and improvised techniques. She worked with fierce concentration, as if precision and care could retroactively justify her survival. Sometimes she talked while she worked, describing procedures she had performed in her previous life, operations she had conducted in proper facilities with proper equipment. Her voice held a quality of mourning, grief not for people but for competence, for the ability to heal instead of merely extend suffering. She had been trained to save lives. The Penal Legions had trained her to watch death and do nothing. Fen rarely spoke. The boy had been marked by service in ways the rest of us had not. He had entered the Legion before his mind had fully formed, before he had developed the psychological defenses that allowed adults to compartmentalize trauma. Everything he had experienced had become part of his foundational understanding of reality. He believed, with the absolute certainty of youth, that the galaxy was fundamentally hostile, that survival required constant vigilance, that trust was a luxury that got you killed. We tried to teach him otherwise but lacked the tools. How could we offer hope when we possessed none ourselves? The Imperial Creed teaches that suffering has purpose, that pain is purifying, that through tribulation, the faithful prove their worth and earn the Emperor's grace. I had heard these teachings my entire life, had absorbed them without question, had believed them with the unthinking faith of the indoctrinated. Service in the Penal Legions had not destroyed that faith cleanly. That would have been easier. Instead, it had complicated faith, twisted it into something unrecognizable. I still believed in the Emperor. How could I not? His existence was fact, verifiable and documented. But I no longer believed he cared. No being that cared could permit what I had witnessed. No benevolent God would demand such sacrifice from those least able to provide it. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the Emperor's benevolence was never meant for individuals, but for humanity as a species, an abstraction so large that individual suffering became invisible. The death of 1 billion souls was tragedy. The death of one was irrelevant. We had been irrelevant. Our lives, our suffering, our deaths, all of it meaningless in the vast calculus of imperial strategy. The recognition should have been liberating. If nothing mattered, then failure was impossible. But it was not liberating. It was crushing. To know that you do not matter, that your entire existence could be erased without consequence, that the galaxy would continue exactly as before whether you lived or died. One morning, I woke to find Hendrik gone. He had left during the night without word or warning. We searched the immediate area but found no trace of him. No body, no signs of struggle. He had simply vanished, choosing solitude over our damaged company. I understood. There were days when I wanted to do the same, when the presence of other survivors felt like accusation rather than comfort, when every face reminded me of those who had not survived, when the weight of memory became too heavy to bear in proximity to others who shared it. Time continued its slow erosion. Our settlement deteriorated despite our efforts to maintain it. Shelters collapsed. The garden produced less each season. The cistern cracked, leaking precious water. We were dying slowly, victim not to violence but to entropy, the universe's patient dismantling of everything we tried to build. Perhaps it was appropriate. Perhaps this was our true punishment, not death but this half-life, this existence in the spaces between, neither properly alive nor decently dead. I began to write, not because I believed anyone would read my words, but because writing was the only way to process what I had experienced. I scavenged paper from abandoned buildings, used charcoal for ink, covered page after page with cramped script that documented everything I could remember. The names of the dead, the circumstances of their deaths, the small moments of humanity that had persisted even in hell. I wrote because forgetting felt like a second death, a final erasure that would render their suffering completely meaningless. If I could remember, if I could record, then perhaps their lives had mattered. Perhaps the galaxy would know, even if it did not care. The pages accumulated over months, hundreds of them, hidden in a waterproof container I had fashioned from salvaged materials. I told myself that someday someone would find them, that someday my testimony would reach ears that could understand. But I knew the truth. The pages would rot. The words would fade. The names I recorded would be lost to time and decay, and the simple indifference of a galaxy too vast to notice the suffering of condemned criminals on a forgotten world. Still, I wrote. What else could I do? Olaine died during a particularly harsh winter. Not from cold, though the temperature dropped low enough to freeze water solid, but from infection. A minor cut on her hand became septic. Without proper antibiotics, without the tools of her trade, she could only watch as the infection spread up her arm, turning flesh black, filling her blood with toxins. She remained lucid until the end, describing her symptoms with clinical detachment, diagnosing her own death with the precision of the professional she had been. Near the end, she asked me to remember her as she had been before conscription, young and idealistic and convinced that medicine could heal the galaxy's wounds. I promised I would, though the promise was empty. I could barely remember my own past. Remembering hers was impossible. Fen lasted another year. He grew tall and thin, his body developing despite malnutrition, his mind growing harder and more closed. He never laughed, never showed joy or hope or anything except grim determination to survive one more day. He was killed by unexploded ordnance, stepping on a mine that had lain dormant for years, waiting with mechanical patience for someone to trigger it. The explosion was instant, merciful in its way. He did not suffer, did not linger, simply existed one moment and ceased to exist the next. We buried what remained of him next to Lena and Olaine, adding another crude marker to our growing cemetery. I was alone then, the last survivor of our small group, the last witness to what we had endured and what we had become. The solitude was absolute and suffocating. I spoke to the dead, carrying on conversations with people who could not answer, asking questions that had no solutions. I maintained the settlement through pure routine, repairing shelters that no longer needed repair, tending gardens that fed only one person. I existed in a state of suspension, neither alive nor dead but something between, waiting for an end I could not hasten. The Penal Legions continued their operations. I knew this because sometimes, on clear nights, I could see the flashes of orbital bombardments on the horizon. New wars, new worlds. New condemned souls fed into the machinery of imperial justice. The cycle was eternal. As long as the Imperium stood, as long as humanity fought for survival against the galaxy's endless threats, there would be Penal Legions. There would be conscripts and collars and commissars. There would be men and women stripped of identity and sent to die in darkness. My survival changed nothing. My testimony would change nothing. The machine was too large, too entrenched, too fundamental to the Imperium's functioning to be affected by individual revelation. Yet I continued to write. Page after page, year after year, recording not just what had happened but what it had felt like. The texture of fear, the weight of hunger, the sound of a man screaming as his collar detonated, the smell of promethium and blood, and the sweet, sick stench of infection. I wrote because humans are creatures of narrative, because we impose meaning through story even when meaning does not exist. I wrote because it was the only act of defiance available to me, the only way to resist complete erasure. Sometimes I wondered if the others had truly died or if they had simply escaped. If Hendrik had found transport off-world, if Fen had survived the explosion and fled, if Olaine had faked her death to avoid the burden of my company. The thoughts were irrational, born of isolation and desperation, but they provided comfort. The alternative was admitting that I was genuinely alone, the sole remaining witness, and that when I died, everything we had experienced would die with me. Age crept upon me slowly. Grey appeared in my hair. My joints ached in the morning. Scars that had healed imperfectly caused constant low-level pain. I was not old by any objective standard, but service in the Penal Legions had aged me in ways that transcended chronology. I felt ancient. Felt as if I had lived a dozen lifetimes, each one ending in trauma, each death partial but cumulative. I was a collection of endings masquerading as a single continuous existence. The brand on my cheek faded over time but never disappeared entirely. It remained visible in certain light, a reminder that the Imperium's judgments were permanent, that no amount of time or distance could erase what I had been, that I would die marked as condemned, my redemption purchased but never acknowledged, my debt paid in full but never forgiven. The injustice of it should have angered me. Instead, it simply was. Anger required energy I no longer possessed. I thought often about redemption, the concept that had defined our entire existence in the Penal Legions. We had been told our service would redeem us, that dying well would wash away our sins, that the Emperor judged hearts as well as actions. But redemption required someone to redeem, required acknowledgement and forgiveness and the restoration of status. We had received none of these things. We had died and our deaths had been footnotes in reports filed by officers who did not know our names. If that was redemption, then the word had lost all meaning. Perhaps redemption was never meant for us. Perhaps it was meant for the Imperium itself, a way to transform waste into utility, to ensure that even the condemned served a purpose. Our deaths redeemed nothing about ourselves, but redeemed the system that had judged us, proving that imperial justice was perfect and complete, that every soul could be made useful, that nothing was ever truly wasted. We were redemption for a civilization that required constant justification for its cruelty. The realization should have broken me. Perhaps it did. I no longer knew what brokenness felt like because I had nothing intact to compare it to. I existed, I endured, I wrote. These were the actions that defined me, and I performed them with mechanical consistency, a human servitor executing programming I could no longer remember receiving. Years passed. The settlement crumbled further. I moved less, wrote more. My pages numbered in the thousands, a vast testimony to suffering that no one would ever read. I told myself this was enough. That bearing witness was sufficient. That memory alone could justify survival. But I did not believe it. I had stopped believing in justification of any kind. Things happened because they happened. Causes and effects linked in chains too complex to understand. Meaning was what we imposed afterward, a story we told ourselves to make chaos bearable. On a morning I cannot specify with any precision, I woke to find Imperial forces in the settlement. Not guard units but Arbites, their black armor gleaming, their weapons trained on my shelter. They had finally found me. After years of hiding, years of survival, the Imperium's patient machinery had caught up. I should have run, should have fought, should have done something. Instead, I felt only relief. The waiting was over. The suspension had ended. Whatever came next would at least be definitive. They took me without violence, secured my hands, loaded me into a transport, confiscated my pages, thousands of them, cramming them into evidence containers without reading them. I wanted to tell them to be careful, that those pages were important, that they contained testimony that mattered. But the words died unspoken. The Arbites did not care about testimony. They cared about compliance and order, and the execution of imperial law. The trial was brief, the same as my first trial, the one that had condemned me years before. A servitor judge, a mechanical voice pronouncing guilt, no defense, no evidence, no possibility of appeal. I was guilty of desertion, guilty of removing my collar, guilty of surviving when I should have died. The sentence was summary execution, to be carried out immediately. They took me to a courtyard, made me kneel. A single Arbit raised his bolt pistol, the weapon massive in his gauntleted hand. I thought of the men I had known, thought of Lena and Hendrik and Olaine and Fen and Legionnaire 55-23 and all the others whose names I had recorded and would now be lost. I thought of my pages, sitting in evidence containers, condemned to be destroyed unread. I thought of the Penal Legions continuing their operations, new condemned souls replacing those who had fallen, the cycle eternal and unbreakable. The Arbit spoke. He asked if I had final words. I almost laughed. What words could encompass what I had experienced? What testimony could compress years of suffering into a single statement? I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. Finally I spoke, not for myself but for them, for everyone who had died unnamed and unmourned. We mattered, I said. We mattered, and you never knew our names. The Arbit's finger tightened on the trigger. The last thing I saw was the Emperor's ocula embossed on the courtyard wall, wings spread, watching with the same indifference it had always shown. Then light, then nothing. The Penal Legions endure. They endure because the Imperium needs them, because justice demands punishment, because war requires ammunition regardless of its source. New condemned arrive daily. New collars are locked. New commissars bark orders. New legionnaires die in the same ways their predecessors died, learning the same lessons, suffering the same fates, purchasing the same empty redemption. And in a forgotten evidence vault somewhere in the Imperium's vast bureaucracy, thousands of pages sit unread. A testimony to suffering that will never be acknowledged, a record of names that will never be remembered, a witness to horrors that the galaxy has already forgotten. This is the truth of the Penal Legions. This is the daily horror. This is what it means to be judged worthless and made useful through death. We were human once. We had names and hopes and lives that mattered to someone. The Imperium took everything and called it redemption. And when we were gone, it simply found more souls to condemn. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is no mercy for the fallen. There is only service and death and the eternal grinding of machinery that transforms human souls into currency. The Penal Legions are that machinery made manifest, proof that even the condemned serve a purpose, even if that purpose is simply to die so that others might live. We purchased time with our blood. We purchased ground with our bodies. We purchased nothing for ourselves except the knowledge that our suffering was noted, recorded, and ultimately dismissed as the necessary cost of an empire that spans the stars. This is redemption in the 41st millennium. This is justice. This is the Emperor's mercy, and it never ends.